Berkshire Hathaway has a lot of money, $20 billion, in Apple.
Do you have a smartphone
I do not have a smartphone.
with you, or you don't own one?
I don't own one. I don't need to know things instantaneously. I'm not making buy and sell decisions based on instant news. I'm making them sometimes after I've looked at a company for years and years. When we bought Apple a year ago or thereabouts, it had been something I'd looked at a long time.
But think of all the money you would have made if you hadn't looked at it quite so long.
That's true. Yeah, people remind me of that occasionally.
And you say?
I say that I make a lot of mistakes.
Well, a couple of years ago, you got a Kindle. Have you looked at the iPad, Warren?
No.
Oh, that's going to make Bill.
No, I will be the last guy in the world with a landline phone reading a daily newspaper. And you're going to come out and interview me someday, and you're going to say, here's the last man on the planet.
The last one. Well, Bill, you guys just shelved your plans for a tablet over at Microsoft. Was that a concession in a way to say, geez, the iPad came out swinging here, it had huge sales?
No. The tablet is a device where you have input. You can take notes and write. And Microsoft has a lot of different tablet projects that we're pursuing. We think that work with the pen that Microsoft pioneered will become a mainstream for students and can give you a device that you can not only read, but also create documents at the same time.
That's the one I'll use.
Because it has a pen.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier for
Yeah.
you. You look at a company like Apple right now, its market cap, and I know, Bill, you might argue with this because of the way they actually count the shares, but is bigger than a company like Berkshire. It's now counted bigger than Microsoft, maybe bigger than everything except ExxonMobil. What does that say to you about how intelligently or not the market is valuing companies?
I think what it's saying is Steve Jobs has done a terrific job, and there will be companies that excel, and occasionally they will excel because of luck, but usually they excel because of brains.
Bill?
Yes, I think both in general and in this specific, Apple's done a great job.
That Apple has been suggested by some analysts who are pretty smart that they should get into the electric vehicle business and maybe do so by buying Tesla. You and Charlie Munger, your vice chair, did this years ago with BYD buying electric vehicle and electric battery company. Would you suggest that Apple get into, or would you support it if they bought Tesla?
Well, I would support what Tim Cook does, but I think it would be a very poor idea to get into the auto business. It is not an easy business. And incidentally, the auto business is different than some. If you're a premier with Google on search, or you're a premier, with movies on Netflix, whatever it be, there's a huge first mover and size and and network effect and all that working for you. You can win in autos one year and you lose the next. I mean, you've got a dozen big companies out there with resources. They're going to keep coming. They copy what you do. People move from one year to another. You don't worry about the fact that your whole life is on the iPhone, as opposed to, you don't want your whole life to be in one car or something. It does not give you a permanent advantage.
Your biggest holding is Apple. You have $47 billion or so in Apple shares. And Apple just had a huge event this week. It was star-studded. People like Oprah Winfrey and Jennifer Aniston were there, Reese Witherspoon. It was all to unveil this new streaming services that they have, news, entertainment. I just wonder, I know you have an iPad. Are you going to be downloading any of those things on your iPad?
Yeah, well, I'm right up to the day. Here's my phone, incidentally, so Alexander Graham Bell lent it to me, and I forgot to return it. The entertainment is a game is really, the big players are in it, and they're playing for keeps. And one problem they all have is that everybody just has two eyeballs, and they've got X hours of discretionary time. They're going to sleep, they're going to work, and so maybe they have 4 or 5 hours a day and two eyeballs, and they're using them now. And now they're going to have obviously there's disruption going on in delivering various things to you. People are always going to want to watch sports. They're always going to want to watch news. But for certain things, they'll want to watch the Olympics. The question is how much it's worth to whoever gets it to them. But you've got some very, very, very big players that are going to fight over those eyeballs. The eyeballs aren't going to double. The time isn't going. It's a relatively fixed market, and when you get the size of certain players and disrupted in an enormous way by Netflix, which nobody dreamt about really 10 or so years ago. And we'll see how a game like that comes out. But that's not an easy game to predict, because you have very smart people with lots of resources trying to figure out how to grab another half hour of your time. And I would not want to play in that game myself. That's too tough for me.
Well, you kind of are. It's your biggest investment.
Oh, no. Apple's a lot more than, that Apple, I'd love to see them succeed. That's a company that can afford a mistake or two. You don't want to buy stock in a company that has to do everything right. That is not a good investment. You want, in the mining business, they said, any mine being dug should be able to stand a certain amount of bad luck, because you run into different things as you really get 5,000 feet down or whatever it may be. And there's some businesses that are quite predictable. Berkshire's made lots of mistakes over the years. And when I say Berkshire, I mean me, but I say Berkshire. We started with a textile mill, and we had two other companies that fed into Berkshire, Diversified Retailing and Blue Chip Stamps. One was trading stamps, that went to zero, and we started Diversified Retailing with the department store in Baltimore, which eventually disappeared. So, you're going to make mistakes. You don't want to make them with too big a portion of your capital, and you want to recognize them when you do it, and you want to basically hang on to your winners. And so I don't. It may just be the fact that I'm, an 88-year-old male, so I don't look back and think about all my mistakes all the time. It'd take too long anyway. So Apple should do some things that don't work. They have got a marvelous.
This is not a huge endorsement of what they just announced this week. You think this is going to be one of the things?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I know that if I'm Bob Iger at Disney, I'm going to think about every way that I can to beat him to the punch. If I'm AT&T, if I'm Comcast, and obviously Netflix is going to try and make sure that Apple doesn't get part of their territory. That is capitalism. That it's produced. Well, just think of what Dallas, 250 years ago, three lifetimes like mine, less than 3 lifetimes like mine. There wasn't anything here. And just look around you, as you come from the airport or wherever. This is a product of an incredible system. I get the goosebumps when I hear God Bless America, something like that. Because this country, in 3 of my lifetimes, has turned, something that the French were willing to sell a quarter of it to us for $15 million. And throw in the mineral rights, which people in this audience will understand. Part of the payment for the Louisiana Purchase, 20% of the payment was what was it, $3 million at 15, 200,000 ounces of gold. And we got South Dakota, where one mine turned out 40 million ounces of gold. I don't know who made that deal for France, but so this system is just remarkable. And when 10 years from now, when we look at the entertainment delivery, it will be what people want. It'll be in the form they want. It'll be whatever the creativity comes up with, and it's going to be a very, very big, hotly contested game. And the one thing I can guarantee is the public will be the winner.
Let me ask you very quickly. Apple also announced a credit card that they're releasing in the city this week. It is supposed to have no fees, and you don't even really need a physical card. You can do it just right over your phone. Does that concern you about Amex, where you also have something like $16 billion invested?
We own about 18% of Amex, and everybody in the world wants to control payments. And I felt a little better, though. I was talking to Richard Fisher here just a few minutes ago, and he reminded me that the currency in circulation is now 1.7 trillion, which is up from about 9. The currency in circulation goes up 6% a year. Now, I don't know whether that's all a bunch of people tucking dollar bills or $100 bills under their pillows because they don't like interest rates that well currently. But payments is a huge, huge game, and different countries will respond in different ways. But I like our 18% position in Amex, and I like our 5.5% position in Apple.
He bought a basket of 75 million Apple shares. Apple hitting a record high. It's up 4% since this was all disclosed. Did you purchase it through puts? Did you get a negotiated price?
No, we bought stock in the open market. So day by day, we bought it, and that's the way we buy virtually everything, Liz.
So you didn't get any special deal?
Oh, no. We just bought it. We would sometimes, I would just tell Mark in the morning, do 10% of the volume or do 5% of the volume or whatever it may be, and here's the limit, and he takes care of it.
You were adding to a position already.
Right.
Who was the first to bring Apple to your table?
Well, one of our managers talked to me about it, but of course I was familiar. I knew Steve Jobs a little bit, and not very much, but I've been familiar with the company. But I got a perspective on it, developed it, and aided by one of the people in the office. But
you won't
aided
say
by observation.
you won't say
I
Ted or Todd?
I never identified it.
Okay.
But it just became apparent to me as one of the great. Well, is maybe the greatest consumer product ever developed virtually, and we'll see over time.
Better than the popcorn maker at the,
Well, not in my personal
Pampered
life.
Chef?
Not in my personal life. I use a popcorn popper more.
Much more than the iPhone.
Yeah, although a shareholder sent me an iPhone 10, and he sent me a nice, very, very nice letter with it, and kind of explaining to it like he would to a 2-year-old how to do it, and I'll get to it. I like our Apple holdings very much. I mean, it is our largest holdings, and actually, what hurts in the case of Apple is that the stock has gone up, and we'd much rather have the stock. And I'm not proposing anything be done about it, but we'd much rather have the stock at a lower price so we could buy more stock. And importantly, if Apple, I think they authorized another $75 billion the other day, but let's say they're going to spend $100 billion in buying in their stock in the next 3 years. It's very simple. If they buy it at 200, they're going to get 500 million shares. They've got 4,600 million out now, and so they'll end up with 4.1 billion under that circumstance. If they're buying it at 150, they buy in 667 million shares. And instead of owning what we would own the first case, the divisor would be less than 4 billion, and we'd own a greater percentage of it. So in effect, a major portion of earnings, at least possibly, it's at least been authorized, will be spent in terms of increasing our ownership without us paying out a dime, which I love for a business, a wonderful business. And the recent development, when the stock has moved up substantially, actually hurts Berkshire over time. We'll still do, in my opinion, we'll do fine, but we're not going to get into, we're not going to dissect our expectations about Apple, for people who may be buying it against us tomorrow or something. We don't give away investment advice on that for nothing. But we have all the things you've mentioned. Obviously, we know about. We know some. We've got a whole bunch of other variables that we crank into it, and we like the fact that it's our largest holding. Charlie?
Well, in my family, the people who have Apple phones, it's the last thing they'll give up.
Not a bad item to have.
But you thought about Apple's earnings. They just came out this past week. Better than a lot of people had been expecting. Were they better than you had been expecting?
Well, I don't really have big expectations about quarterly earnings with that company, even with Berkshire. I mean, so I was pleased with what they reported, but it wasn't like I had something going in my mind. If they reported X, I was going to be happy. And if they reported 98% of X, I was going to, be panicked or something of the sort. But what they talked about and reported is consistent with the reason we own $50 billion plus of Apple. I feel good about Apple.
Have you been buying more Apple?
We haven't changed our holdings unless, and I have no reason to think this is true, but there's one fellow that owns a little over 1% of our holdings in the office, and I don't see what he does day to day. I have no reason to think he's bought or sold Apple.
You have a $45 billion stake, more or less. How closely do you follow the company? You know, people are concerned they haven't really introduced any new products.
Well, if you have to closely follow a company, you shouldn't own it.
Really?
No, if you buy a business, if you buy a farm, do you go up and look, every couple of weeks to see how far the corn is up, and do you worry too much about whether somebody says this is going to be a year of low prices because exports are being affected or anything like that? You buy a farm and you hold it for. I've got one farm that I bought in the 1980s, and my son runs it, but I've been there once, it doesn't grow faster if I go and stare at it. I can't cheer for it, more effort, or something like that. And I know there's going to be some years when prices are going to be good and some when the prices aren't going to be good. I know there's years when yields will be better than others, but I bought the farm. And if it just doesn't, I don't care about economic predictions on it or anything of the sort. I do care that over the years it's well tended to in terms of rotating crops, and I hope yields get better, which they generally have. In fact, that farm 100 years ago would have probably produced 30 bushels, maybe 35 bushels of corn per acre, and now in a good year, it'd be 200. We've really made progress in this country. That's one reason commodity prices, if you go back a couple hundred years, they've moved so little, is because we've just gotten better and better at.
And so Apple is kind of like a farm.
Well, it's a long-term investment, and if you own the best auto dealership in town, the best brand, and you had somebody good running it, you wouldn't drop by every day and say, how many people have come in today, or I think interest rates are going up a little, maybe it'll slow down our sales or anything. No, you buy it knowing there's 365 days a year, and you're going to own it for 20 years, so that's 7,300 days, and things are going to be different from day to day and year to year. You shouldn't buy it if the day-to-day stuff is important.
And some of the stuff we do, we just know it's a little better than our alternatives. We're doing all kinds of stuff now that we would not have done. We never would have bought Apple stock in the old days. It's a very odd thing for us to do, and obviously we've got no special insights as to how sticky Apple's business is. Apple whole supply chain is like one man with 2 million employees. That's very peculiar. And the man is not perfect. And on the other hand, Apple has a very sticky bunch of customers. Will they be able to keep that going? And if so, how long? I don't know, but I think the chances are pretty good it's going to be quite sticky. And that's why we bought it. But as I say, we may have a slight edge in our favor there. But it's not a big edge. We're doing that because we don't find the stuff we used to find where we knew we couldn't lose. Apple, we've merely got what we think is a little edge. We don't have a big insight that can't fail. But if you got the money, you have to put it somewhere, and you can't find what you used to like, you have to put it with what's best available. It's a nice problem to have so much money.
Apple financially is very, very logically run. I think that in terms of a business operator, I don't know enough about technology to evaluate technologists, but he is very, very, very good. Everything he does makes sense. Apple and Facebook, Microsoft, Google, in aggregate, just those four will have well over $2 trillion of market value. They require no net tangible assets. So they are the business, and they're wonderful business. Here's Apple, earning 40 or so billion plus after tax, and with $3 billion of inventory, no
no fixed assets really required. They've just finished a big building. No receivables to speak of. It takes no capital. That's a different world than when Andrew Carnegie got rich and John D. Rockefeller. I mean, they had to build one steel mill, take the profits from that over time, build another steel mill, maybe borrow some money. But the world where you can translate an economic model into something that's worth hundreds and hundreds of billions, approaching $1 trillion of value with no tangible assets, that's a different economic model that even, if you go back to 1960 when the number one company would have been General Motors and down the list. You can now get, there are businesses which don't require much inventory, they don't require fixed assets, they don't require receivables, and they get extraordinary margins, and that is a different investment world. That doesn't mean both kinds of businesses can't exist, but those are extraordinary economic opportunities. I don't think they existed to this, well, they didn't exist remotely to the same degree 50 or 60 years ago when more was tied to physical assets. And that makes a very different investment world.
Do you think Apple would do better spending $100 billion on buybacks or buying other productive businesses the way you have generally preferred? $100 billion is a lot of money.
I used to think so. Apple has a incredible consumer product, which you understand a lot better than I do. Whether they should buy in their shares, they shouldn't buy in their shares at all unless they think that they're selling for less than they're worth. And if they are selling for less than they're worth and they have the money and they don't see an acquisition that's even more attractive, they should buy in their shares. And I think that that's because I think it's extremely hard to find acquisitions that would be accretive to Apple, that would be in the 50 or 100 billion or $200 billion range. They do a lot of small acquisitions. And, I'm delighted to see them repurchasing shares. Let's say we own 250 million or so shares. They have, I think, 4,923,000,000 or something like that. And mentally, you can say we own 5% of it. But I figure with the passage of a little time, we may own 6 or 7% simply because they repurchase shares. And I find it, if you got an extraordinary product and ecosystem, and there's lots to be done, I love the idea of having our 5% or whatever it may be grow to 6 or 7% without us laying out a dime. I mean, it's worked for us in many other situations. But you have to have some very, very, very special product, and which has an enormously widespread ecosystem, and the product's extremely sticky and all of that sort of thing. And they're not going to find 50 or $100 billion acquisitions that they can make it remotely a sensible price that really become additive to that. And they may find it, who knows? But there certainly, as I look around the horizon, I don't see anything that would make a lot of sense for them in terms of what they'd have to pay and what they would get. And whereas I do see a business that they know everything about, and where they may or may not be able to buy it at an attractive price when they repurchase their shares, that remains to be seen. Incidentally, that's one thing that I always enjoy. People say, well, you're talking your book or something if you talk. From our standpoint, we would love to see Apple go down in price. They're going to, well, just put it this way. If Andrew and Charlie and I were partners in a business that was worth $3 million, so each of us had $1 million interest in it, if Andrew offered to sell out his 1/3 interest at $800,000 and we had the money around, we jump at the chance to buy him out. I mean, it's so simple. But people get all lost, and if he wanted $1.2 million for it, we wouldn't pay it to him. It's very simple math, but it gets lost in all these discussions. And of course, like I say, Tim Cook can do simple math, and he can probably do very complicated math too. So we very much approve of them repurchasing shares. Charlie?
I think generally speaking in America, when companies go out hell-bent to buy other companies, they're worth less after the transaction is made than they were before. So I don't think you have a general weight of wealth for American corporations to go out and buy other corporations. Averaged out, it's a way down, not up. And I think that a great many places have nothing better to do than to buy in their own stock, and nothing as advantageous to do as as buying in their own stock. So I think we know pretty damn well what's going to happen to Apple. They'd be very lucky if there was something available at a low price that they could buy. I don't think the world's that easy. I think that the reason these companies are buying their stock is that they're smart enough to know that it's better for them than anything else.
That does not mean we approve of every buyback at all, though. I mean, we've seen...
No. I think some people just buy it to keep the stock up. And that, of course, is insane and immoral. But apart from that, it's fine.
It is an unbelievable company. I mean, if you look at Apple, I think it earns almost twice as much as the second most profitable company in the United States. It's a wide gap. I mean, it's an amazing business. I mean, here's a company that's, whatever the earnings are, 60 billion or whatever, and you can put all their products on a dining room table. I mean, that's not the way it used to be in this country.
There were a lot of doubters on Wall Street before those numbers came out this week. Were you in the camp that was a little worried about what was happening?
Well, we don't own it for the next quarter. I mean, it is incredible to me how you read the investor conference calls after reports, or you read all the analyst reports, and they talk about what it's going to do next year. Nobody buys a farm based on whether they think it's going to rain next year or not. They buy it because they think it's a good investment over 10 or 20 years. So the relevant question when you're looking at buying part of a business, which you're doing when you buy a stock, is where's it going to be in 10 or 20 years? It may be that you don't know, in which case you don't have to do anything. But the idea of spending loads of time trying to guess how many iPhone 10s or whatever it may be are going to be sold in a given 3-month period or something, it just, to me, it totally misses the point. I mean, it was like worrying about the number of BlackBerries, 10 years ago. And then what really counted was what was going to happen over the next 10 years.
Right. So the shares sold down before that, heading into it. Do you like the stock? Have you bought more of it? Do you think that that's another place you want to be?
Well, I don't talk about what we're going to do, but our 10Q is coming out on Saturday morning, so they can actually figure it out from looking at the footnotes in there. We bought quite a bit more Apple in the first quarter, at the first calendar quarter of this year. It's their second quarter fiscally.
More than you had reported in February when we got the SEC filings. I think it was 163.5 million.
Well, that's what we had at year end. Yeah, I think we had something like that.
That was the February 14th figures.
Well, that was probably, that was reported on February 14th. I think that was as of December 31st. And I think it counts our pension holdings too, maybe. But you're right, we had 160-odd million shares in Berkshire.
Wait, so you bought a lot more in the first quarter?
Quite a bit more, yeah.
I mean, you own a lot already, so when you say a lot more...
Well, it'll come out on Saturday morning, and so it'll be reported, and we're not going to be active now. So you'll see it went up about 75 million shares.
Wow.
I've felt that Apple has an extraordinary consumer franchise. Apple's a different kind of business than IBM. They're both tech, obviously, in a major way, and they even have a joint venture, on some things. But I think I understand consumer behavior perhaps better than I do the tech business. Wouldn't take much to beat it. And I liked it. I like Tim Cook very much. I like their policies. I see how strong that ecosystem is to an extraordinary degree. I mean, I look at my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and everybody in the office. I mean, their families. I talked to the people at the Furniture Mart. When the 10 hadn't arrived, nobody goes over to buy an Android. I mean, it's you were very, very, very locked in, at least psychologically and mentally, to the product you're using. I mean, you got all kinds of stuff up on there. It's a very sticky product.
I think buying the Apple stock is a good sign in Warren. And now he did run around Omaha and ask if he could take his grandchildren's tablets away. And I mean, he did market research. I do think we keep learning, and more important, we don't unlearn the old tricks. But the young men make some contributions. They cause us to think about things we wouldn't have thought about before. We would not have bought the airlines or the Apple if the young man hadn't come up with the idea. But once they did, Warren ran with it. And Warren's pretty great. It was hard to buy that much airline stock.
I said it must be an awkward conversation with Bill Gates after that Apple stock buy.
Bill Gates does not have any illusions on that subject. Bill Gates bought that $150 million with Apple. I think they sold it.
Right.
Yeah, and
that was a good buy.
Yeah, but it was not a good sale.
One of your new holdings, Apple, one of your big holdings, just came out with its earnings this week. And the initial reaction from Wall Street was to sell off the stock a little bit because of disappointing numbers of iPhone sales. Is it safe to assume that you still don't own an iPhone?
That's safe to assume. Yeah, you can put that one in. You don't have to ask me that again for another 5 years. I've got a very, very effective flip phone, although I don't have it on me.
What did you think of Apple's earnings?
Well, it's about what I expect, but I don't own it because of what I think the earnings are going to be in the next 3 months or 6 months. It's very hard to figure out how much people delayed their buying of iPhones because of the launch of a new one in 6 months. I've talked to our guys at the Furniture Mart, and they say there's a lot of that, but
a lot of people waiting.
A lot of people wait. Yeah. I mean, if you knew a new car was coming out tomorrow, a new model of something or other, and you had to pay the same, roughly the same. I don't know whether they're going to sell the new one, but close to the same for the last year model. You're probably going to wait. I mean, so I think it's an incredible consumer product.
They also have a cash hoard of over $250 billion. Are
right.
you jealous?
I'm very jealous. Yeah, I thought I was doing okay until I look at their balance sheet. On the other hand, we've got ours here in the United States.
What would you like to see Apple do with that cash hoard?
I love the fact they repurchase shares. Now what they're doing now is borrowing money in the United States, figuring they'll get that money back at some point or another. And so they're really buying in their stock using borrowed money, but with the knowledge that if they had to, they could take it back now and pay a big repatriation tax. But they probably hope that tax comes down. And my guess is that at some point or other, that money will end up back in the United States, or most of it. And I like buying it. If I like buying the stock myself, I like the company buying it. I obviously think that that it's a good buy. And if you can buy your own stock, there's no company you should understand better than your own company. And I think buying in stock makes a lot of sense at one price, and I think it does not make sense at another price. I think it should be price sensitive. Most companies don't look at it that way, but that's the way I look at it.
The train has left the station, as Joe likes to so frequently point out. Yeah. How come you don't feel that way about shares of Apple? How come you feel like that's a different story?
The shares, when we bought them, at least, were much more reasonable in relation to current earnings. Apple didn't have to do a lot better in the future than they were doing at the current time. When you get into a Google and Amazon, you're paying for the future more, but they may well have a better future. I mean, that may be more than justified. And Apple, I wouldn't say it's easier for me to understand than Google now, perhaps, or Amazon now. Certainly would have been 5 years ago. It's amazing where well, where, yeah, Apple's ended up with consumers. I mean, I can very easily determine the competitive position of Apple now and who's trying to chase them and how easy it is to chase them. We happen to be well situated in terms of having these massive home furnishing stores, and I can learn very easily how consumers react to different things there. Probably easier than I can trying to pick out what's really happening at Amazon at any given time.
So you use your research at the Nebraska Furniture Mart to tell you that consumers prefer Apple over Samsung, or I mean, what type of thing are you?
Well, the interesting thing is if you come in to buy a TV set at the Furniture Mart, price is extremely important. Now, obviously, there's all those great pictures just sitting up there. So you can have Samsung, you have all these different ones, and if you put on a sale and you drop the price of Samsung 10%, we can fill that department with people that come out for it. You can't move people by price in the smartphone market remotely like you can move them in appliances or all kinds of things. I mean, people want the product. They don't want the cheapest product. And the loyalty is huge. Now, that doesn't mean somebody can't come along with a product that just jumps the field in some way. But and then once you have the product, the degree to which it sort of controls your life, I mean, it's a very, very, very valuable product to the people that build their lives around it. And that's true of 8-year-olds, and it's true of 80-year-olds.
People who have questioned Apple's future have said things like, well, right now people are paying $800 for a smartphone, and the other reality in technology is that prices eventually come down. And unless you're adding more and more value to that product, the price will come down. So what happens if people, I mean, I guess the question is, will people always be willing to pay $800 or more for a phone, or will that wind up being a cost that comes down and down just as technology
it can be that way, but usually because there's competition between different products, and some manufacturer decides that they can't beat, say, Apple on their own terms, so they drop them $100 or $200. Some products are very susceptible to that, and other products are not. And so far, I mean, you've had smartphones and big differences in price categories, and people come back in, and if they had an Apple before, you're going to have a much cheaper cell phone selling right next to a smartphone selling right next to it, and they don't look at it. If you have a cheaper TV, that picture's looking at you, and you say, wait a second, what's the difference? Right. And you buy the cheaper TV. And that's true of, I mean, most items are price sensitive. And it's not to say that an Apple has somewhat price sensitivity. It's very, very, very little. But somebody could come along and leapfrog something in the way of the technology and adds some benefits that would be the more competitive threat to me than price competition. It would be benefit competition.
Yeah, I don't know what that is, but then, you know, Apple gave me a whole lot of things that I never realized I needed until they came up with them.
And somebody else is trying to think of some other things to give you along the same line.
Just the stock price again. You said that it made sense to you when you started buying into it. Shares have appreciated since then.
That's the problem. Yeah. I'm cheap. and there's always an anchoring problem with buying stocks. If you get used to buying them at X, it's harder to buy them at higher prices.
So does that signify that you've stopped buying an Apple because of where prices have gone?
Well, maybe not. But you slid it in there nice.
Yeah, I've tried. I guess when you see things like the earnings that came out, you had mentioned to us the other day that you weren't bothered or disappointed by the earnings. When you see stock price pull back, you probably like it at that point.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Apple, with a non-new product, I think they sold something like 50 million. That's a lot of units to sell something at $700, and a lot of those are going to people that are actually replacing a present Apple. But they do know that a new product's going to be out in 6 months or something, and you know, who knows? Maybe they got promised an Apple for their birthday or their graduation, but I would be tempted, if I were going to buy one, to wait till the new model comes out. What do I lose by doing it except the use of one in between? That's a lot of product to sell with a new model coming out when you think about 50 million. If you pay big prices for something, you're counting on earnings. you're counting on being right a very high percentage of the time on projections of earnings that go up. And of course, the best kind of earnings are the ones that go up without more capital investment. Very easy to have great earnings in the utility business. You just put a slug of money in and you get a return out of it. The return isn't that great. So you're really looking for something that will grow. And I did mention one thing at the meeting, which I don't think people appreciate at all, is if you take, say, the 5 largest businesses in the country by market value, you're probably, and assuming Berkshire isn't in there, it flips in and flips out. Let's assume we're out. Those 5 businesses have a market value of $2.5 trillion or more, you know, starting with Apple. You could run those 5 businesses with no equity capital. So you have close to 10% of the market value, perhaps, of the United States in 5 extremely good businesses that essentially take no capital. Now, that was not the case in the past. I mean, if you were at the turn of the century and you were talking about U.S. Steel and the big railroads and all that, you made large sums, or Rockefeller with the oil business, by earning money with refineries or steel mills, and finally you earned enough so that you bought another one, and you borrowed some money along the way, but you had to build up equity capital dramatically as you went along. And even if you go back to the Fortune 500 of 30 years ago, the companies that were big took big capital. Now you've got the 5 highest valued companies in the country. They don't take any capital. Even IBM has net no tangible assets. And if you take the equity, GAAP equity, subtract the intangible assets, it's less than 0. And if you take businesses, you know, you take a Google. I mean, they may invest some money in fixed assets and all, but they actually need no equity capital. So you could have a $2.5 trillion business in the United States and not need equity capital. And that is a different world than the past.
You, over the years, over the last 10 or 15 years, have become a much more industrialized companies, things like the railroads that do require more capital equipment, more capital investment. When did you notice that the top 5 market cap companies required no capital investment? When did you make this realization, and does that explain your investment in Apple?
It doesn't explain it. I've understood that for a long time, but it's become more and more concentrated. It used to be ExxonMobil up there, and some. So the shift has been taking place, and essentially, the great businesses have become businesses that don't take capital. And that really wasn't true. I mean, the auto industry took a lot of capital. The aerospace industry took a lot of capital. The railroad industry. These are huge industries that affected America. I mean, they changed our country. Now you've got companies that have huge market values changing the country. They don't take any money.
Those companies, for people who are listening on radio, we did just show a chart of that, or a full screen of it. It's Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and who am I leaving out? And
Facebook.
Facebook, right,
yeah.
And Facebook. Those are the 5. And Alphabet, obviously, the parent company of Google. That's a huge shift.
Those are the wonderful businesses. The businesses that grow and don't require money. And, of course, that's why they're awash in cash. And to the extent they made it abroad, some of it they'd have to pay some tax if they brought it back. Now, they use some capital. I mean, they build headquarters, and they have small amounts of inventory in some cases.
Research and development for some of these issues.
But if you don't need it. Absolutely. I could run those businesses, and they could run them a lot better with absolutely no equity capital. In fact, a huge negative equity capital. You can't run ExxonMobil with that negative capital. You know, you can't run U.S. Steel. You can't run the railroads. You can't run the utilities. All these massive industries. Really what the country was built on up till not that many years ago. And now there's this huge shift to intangibles.
Apple has $250 billion that it's keeping much of it offshore. Would it make sense to have that money brought back to the United States? Does it matter?
I would say yes, it does matter. We don't want people artificially shifting money to some foreign place to avoid U.S. taxes. But it's not artificial if you're really making the money in the foreign place and they don't have high taxes. Why should we care if somebody makes a lot of money in some foreign place and brings it back at a low tax? I think there's a lot, having all this money piled up abroad and then borrowing against it artificially, it's a cockamamie system.
So how do we fix it?
Well, I think they'd bring it back if you had a one-time forgiveness, and I don't think that would hurt anybody.
Do you view IBM and Apple differently?
I regard them as being quite different business. I think Apple is much more of a consumer products business in terms of sort of analyzing moats around it and consumer behavior and all that sort of thing. It's obviously a product with all kinds of tech built into it, but in terms of laying out what their prospective customers will do in the future as opposed to, say, on IBM's customers, it's a different sort of analysis. That doesn't mean it's correct, and we'll find out over time, but they are two different types of decisions. I was wrong on the first one, and we'll find out whether I'm right or wrong on the second. But I do not regard them as apples and apples, and I don't quite regard them as apples and oranges, but it's somewhat in between.
That's a different kind of thinking from the way Warren came up. He's changed, and I think he's changed when he buys airlines, and he's changed when he buys Apple. Think of the hooting we've done over the years about high tech. We just don't understand it. It's not our competency. And what do we appear in the press with? Apple and a bunch of airlines. I don't think we've gone crazy. I think the answer is we're adapting reasonably to a business that's gotten very much more difficult. And I don't think we have a cinch in either of those positions. I think we have the odds a little bit in our favor. And if that's the best advantage we can get, we'll just have to live on the advantage we can get. I used to say you have to marry the best person that will have you. And I'm afraid that's a rule of life, and you have to get by in life with the best advantage you can get. And things have gotten so difficult in the investment world that we have to be satisfied with the type of advantage that we didn't used to get. On the other hand, the thing that caused it to be so difficult was we got so enormously rich. And that's not a bad trade-off.